period of Japanese history, beginning in 794 and continuing until the final decades of the 1100s, is known as the Heian Period, thus named because Japan's imperial capital was relocated from Nara-kyo to a new city called Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto, at the outset of the period. This capital relocation was carried out by the Emperor Kammu, who wanted to get away from Nara partly to get a fresh start after a number of political disturbances there, and partly to escape the influence of the Nara-based religious establishment. Heian-kyo's location was chosen for its ease of access by both land and by water, and its possession of geographical features held to be auspicious in feng shui philosophy. The Heian period is known as the age of the aristocracy, with the Fujiwara clan in particular rising to new heights of power. While the Fujiwara began the Heian period at a relative low point, in the early 800s, the patriarch of one of the Fujiwara houses wedded his daughter to the emperor, thus becoming the emperor's father-in-law and being rewarded with an extremely high political office. His son, Fujiwara no Yoshifusa, further strengthened the Fujiwara hold on power by eliminating aristocratic rivals and managing to become the first non-royal to hold the title of imperial regent. Yoshifusa's son, Fujiwara no Mototsune, carried on this trend by also receiving regency powers, and thus a precedent was established of the Fujiwara being at the helm of Japan's government. For the next few centuries, the Fujiwara would continue to command the regency and other high political offices by marrying their daughters into the imperial family and setting their young grandsons on the throne. Thanks to this approach, they enjoyed the golden age of their power in the Middle Heian period, with the peak of their success coming in the 1000s during the tenure of Fujiwara no Michinaga and his son and successor, Fujiwara no Yorimichi, both of whom effectively controlled government affairs through the reigns of multiple emperors. While the Fujiwara were approaching their golden age, Japan was also experiencing the birth of a unique domestic culture, which would come to define the Heian period. In 894, Japan decided to stop its embassies to Tang China, and this had the unintended effect of cutting off the inflow of continental Asian culture and allowing the cultural influences which had already entered the country to grow and develop in uniquely Japanese ways. One notable aspect of Japanese culture that emerged during the Heian period was the development of the phonetic kana writing systems, hiragana and katakana, which evolved by simplifying Mangyo-gana, an earlier script that used Chinese characters to phonetically represent the Japanese language. With a greater creative freedom having been unlocked by the creation of what was essentially a native writing system, numerous famous works of Japanese literature went on to be authored, with many of them being written by female writers such as Murasaki Shikibu's Tale of Genji and Sei Shonagon's Pillow Book. Japan's newfound cultural identity also came to be expressed through a myriad of other art forms, most notably the Shinden-zukuri style of residential architecture, and paintings called Yamato-e, which focused on Japanese subjects rather than Chinese ones. Culture may have flowered in the capital, but the provincial world of the Heian period was the site of far less glamorous developments. At the end of the Nara period, Japan's government had begun overturning its policy of all land being the property of the emperor by permitting indefinite private land ownership to provincial cultivators establishing new areas for cultivation. At first, these private estates, called shoen, had been subject to taxation, but over time their powerful owners, usually aristocrats or powerful temples and shrines, found ways to acquire exemption. This led the government's revenues to fall, and by the early 900s, the system of state land ownership had completely fallen apart. The government attempted a new approach, reorganizing farmland around the country to be under the management of powerful local farmers and entrusting tax collection to provincial governors. However, these governors got greedy and began taxing overzealously for personal gain, leading the management class farmers to begin donating their lands to the same aristocrats and preeminent temples and shrines who had undermined the old land system, as these were the only actors powerful enough to evade government taxation. In this way, private shoen estates continued to increase in number, being donated higher and higher up the food chain for tax evasion purposes, until a huge chunk of the country's land had ended up in the hands of the top tiers of the aristocracy, particularly the Fujiwara. At the same time, peacekeeping and security out in the provinces became privatized as well, as Japan's government had abolished its official state military at the beginning of the Heian period due to its high cost and relative lack of anything to do. As a result, agricultural land managers began to arm themselves and create little private bands of enforcers to defend their lands, and these were then gradually pulled into the service of the mid-level aristocrats who had left the capital to seek their fortunes as provincial governors. The most prominent of these mid-level aristocratic families were the Taira and the Minamoto, and they and their provincial followers established the foundation of what eventually evolved into the Bushi, what we now know as the samurai class. While the early and mid-Heian period was defined by the supremacy of the Fujiwara, the latter half of the period began to see emperors emerging who were not bound by direct in-law relationships with them. This led to the Fujiwara losing their absolute chokehold on political authority, which instead fell into the hands of a series of retired emperors. The first of these, Emperor Shirakawa, abdicated the throne to his 8-year-old son before going on to control imperial government from behind the scenes for the next 4 decades. Beginning with Shirakawa, this cloistered rule by retired emperors was characterized by an authoritarian bent, and as a result, both government and society shifted to be less constrained by laws and old customs. This change was especially exemplified by Japan's great temples beginning to arm themselves and rely increasingly on the threat of violence to get their way, and by the retired emperors organizing of bushi warriors to serve under them as their own private muscle. Throughout the era of cloistered rule, the Taira and Minamoto aristocratic warrior families established themselves as Japan's premier specialists in all things military and police related. At the tail end of the Heian period, the Taira leader, Taira no Kiyomori, rose to an unprecedented level of power by mobilizing his warriors in a pair of violent internal disputes between members of the aristocracy and imperial family. His military muscle, and the fact that he'd fought on the side of the right people, allowed him to enter the top echelons of imperial government and take the Fujiwara approach of marrying his daughter to the sitting emperor. From here, he pushed aside the retired emperor and eventually placed his own grandson on the imperial throne, effectively establishing Japan's first warrior government. However, the Taira regime did not last long, as in 1180, warriors around the country, organized under the banner of the Taira's rival clan, the Minamoto, rose up in rebellion against Kiyomori. A nationwide civil war known as the Genpei War erupted, and this conflict, which would be immortalized in legend for centuries to come, saw the downfall and destruction of the Taira in 1185. The Minamoto, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo and backed by the majority of the country's provincial warrior population, established a new regime called the Kamakura Shogunate in the Taira's place, and it is this birth of Japan's first shogunal government which marks the end of the Heian period. From here, the royalty and aristocracy began to decline in importance as their authority was eclipsed by that of the warrior class. If you want to know more about the Heian period, please check out videos 8 through 11 in my Japanese History the Textbook series, as well as my deep dive on the Genpei War, where I go into much of this information in greater depth. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and consider joining my Patreon if you'd like to further support the channel. I'd like to end with a big thank you to my patrons, as it is their support which keeps me hard at work on these videos. First off, thank you to my Kuge tier patrons, Dacid Thorn, Forrest Kane, Jay Larson, James Larson, Kakse, Steve Matsui, and Shane Davidson. Next, I'd also like to thank my Bushi tier patrons, Bionic Legs, John Lawson, and Laturnic. Big thanks to all my Hyakusho and free tier patrons as well. See you in the next one, everyone.